Hello, everybody, and welcome to Journalists, Technology, and Wellbeing. We're your co-hosts. I'm Savani Babu.
And I'm Sabine K. Bergman.
We are the co-founders of Hidden Compass, which is an independent journalism outlet and modern exploration society. It is a wild time to be in publishing and journalism right now, and our mission to center the humanity and intelligence of journalists and readers alike feels more poignant now than we ever thought it would. So today's topic is especially important to us.
Today, we're exploring the intersection of journalism, technology, and well-being. In a time when the media landscape is rapidly changing, it's crucial to understand how these forces shape the lives and work of journalists, particularly those from diverse backgrounds. Our esteemed guest today will offer unique perspectives on humanizing digital platforms, navigating online incivility, and fostering well-being within the journalistic profession and beyond. Let's all take a moment to introduce ourselves and our work. Lauren Leader, let's start with you.
I'm Lauren Leader. Hi. I'm the co-founder and CEO of All In Together, which is a women's civic education organization. We train women across America on the tools of civic leadership and participation. We do research, we do training, all kinds of stuff. And I spend a lot of time on various news platforms talking about all of the above.
Wonderful. Lissa Soep, let's go to you next.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. I'm Lissa. I have spent much of my career over the last decades in nonprofit journalism and youth media, and that's taken various forms and connected to different institutions, including youth radio / wire media. I became a journalist after I was offered a tenure track professor job and decided that was not the path that I wanted, and instead I decided to work among, emerging voices in journalism, especially those from underrepresented communities, and to develop stories for various outlets, including National Public Radio. Currently, I work also at Vox Media, where I edit podcasts, run a learning series, and am a part of something really relevant to our conversation called Language Please, which is free style guidance for journalists and storytellers of all kinds who are interested in covering social, cultural, and identity-related issues with thoughtfulness and nuance.
Yes, Lissa, that sounds very relevant to our discussion today. Gina, let's hear from you.
Yes, hi. I'm Gina Masullo. I spent 20 years as a journalist in upstate New York before I became a professor of journalism. Currently, I'm an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Media at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm also associate director of the Center for Media Engagement, where we study media with a lens toward helping and supporting it. My expertise also lies in bridging divides between political divisiveness, finding ways to talk across difference and bring people together across difference without harming our souls, is how I put it, because there's times when we can't. And I am very excited to be here and to talk about this topic.
Wonderful. We're so excited to hear from all of you about this topic. So let's jump in. We're going to start by talking about some of the challenges and then talk about what we're doing about them. So, Lauren, I want to start with you. You've dedicated your career to empowering women in leadership. What are some of the unique challenges women in journalism face?
I mean, boy, how much time do we have? So, look, I think every time women step into the public sphere, there are always forces that push back against them and the amplification of their voices. And I think that has evolved over time in terms of what that's looked like. Certainly in the current moment, there are very serious threats that are posed towards, women who speak out, not just here in the United States, but around the world, on a bunch of levels. One is that they are more likely to receive virtual and real threats of violence for the work that they do. And they are much more likely to be targeted, with sexist and also racist, if they are a person of color, attacks in the social and public domain. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is that, obviously social media has played a significant part of that. But the other piece that is now sort of, not to start on like this super depressing note, but I'm clearly doing that, is that AI is also becoming a factor. So, in some ways, the 2024 election was the first AI election. And what we're seeing is that around the world, in the United States and around the world, women in the public sphere, whether that's journalists or elected officials or even just women who are speaking out, are also more likely to be targeted with sexualized, deepfake, AI generated pornography, and that includes women and girls. So, it's a really fascinating dynamic that, every place around the world where women step up to challenge the status quo, particularly in places, and I think this is like particularly acute in places that are, sort of backsliding on democracy or, emerging autocracies, those regimes often are rising on the backs of women's rights. And so there is a direct correlation between a move towards autocracy, a move away from liberal democracy, and an escalation of efforts to silence and sideline women. And journalists have often, and obviously there's some very high profile examples like a Maria Ressa in the Philippines, who are like perfect examples of that, right? Like she won the Nobel Peace Prize in part because of her fight against the efforts in that country by an autocrat to silence her. But she's not the only one. You see that around the world. And I think what's new is like now we're starting to see, if not in an organized way, we're definitely seeing a lot of that in the United States. And I won't go on too long, but like it is in many ways, I think the biggest threat to women's public engagement, whether that's in journalism or in politics. And it is discouraging. Like women are more likely to step away and to move to the sidelines when they are targeted, by both virtual and real threats of violence. And, just the last thing I'll say is like, there's a real question about whether or not there's actually any difference between virtual violence against women, virtual gender-based violence and real gender-based violence. If you are the victim, it often feels like it's the same. And I think we don't always think about it that way, but so there's a really uplifting, happy way to start this conversation.
No, Lauren, I think you're right. It can feel often depressing to mention these things. Savani said that we're going to start by talking about the challenges, and we will hopefully, luckily get to talk about the solutions later in the conversation. But these are important issues, dark as they may be, to speak about and to raise awareness about. I want to pivot for a moment from focusing on women to focusing on young journalists in particular. Lissa, I know that your work has focused on empowering young journalists. Can you tell us about some of the challenges that young journalists in particular face? We hear about this duality in young journalists' relationship with technology, so maybe you can speak about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you launched right into what, the paradox, I think, at the center of young people's relationships, as I've observed as a collaborator with them, producer and editor of content that they're creating for reaching millions and millions in audiences, is that duality, is the fact that they like the rest of us depend on and are incredibly innovative in use of digital tools and platforms at the same time that they are exhausted by them and in some cases, put at risk as a result of them. So some of the things that I guess to jump into some solutions without or not solutions, but like frameworks that our young journalists, emerging voices have put out around how to navigate within that duality. One of the things, there's sort of like 4 insights that they have led with in some of their reporting that is relevant here, I think, as we set up the conversation. One is insisting on destigmatization and opening up about mental health and well-being themes as they touch their own lives and their communities, with a concurrent call for equitable access to culturally relevant, community-rooted support. So destigmatization isn't the end, it's the beginning. Telling their own stories on their terms is where questions come up and accountability starts around where there are and are not equitable opportunities for well-being. They're asking for stories that are integrated, stories related to mental health and well-being, integrated as opposed to siloed, because mental health and well-being is a thread across every beat. Young people want to hear directly from those most affected by the issues that they're reporting on. But the challenge that brings is safety, as Lauren has said, in the same way that women are targeted. Young people, particularly those from non-dominant communities, are also subjected to various forms of harassment. So mindfulness around the afterlife of the content that they create can be especially important for young journalists. And then finally, there can be a challenge when young people to report on and delve into these issues, that you leaving readers or audiences without hope and without practical tools and resources can sometimes do more harm. So a mindfulness that I've seen among young journalists and have been inspired by is a kind of healing centered approach, even in the way they produce and share content, and being aware of the impact that their stories will have on readers, listeners, viewers, and making sure that they are instilling hope and providing practical resources at the same time that they can often tell troubling stories.
It's really fascinating to think about sort of the lifetime of content that's produced, of stories that are produced now. In the print world back in the day, it would essentially disappear after a while. It would be harder to find. And now with things living online, the opportunities for that online incivility extend over extended periods of time. And so, the incivility part has come up with both of the previous answers. So I want to turn to you, Gina, because your research examines online incivility and its impact on public debate. So how has the nature of online discourse changed in recent years, and what are the implications of that for journalism across the board?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think number one, the biggest change has been that talking online is now part of a journalist's job. And so when they're attacked, it's like they're being required to talk to people who are being really hateful, right? So I think that's a big shift in how we do journalism. And I don't think as an industry, we're fully prepared for that shift, right? Because the question is, well, what should journalists be doing? I've done a lot of research on like, how can they respond when people are criticizing them and what approach? But also research that has shown sometimes the best thing is to not respond when people are too nasty. But the main takeaway is that it's just part of a journalist's life right now to know you're going to be attacked on a fairly regular basis. And if you're a woman journalist, especially a woman journalist of color, or any other marginalized group, a trans journalist, you're going to get more of that. So I don't think we as an industry have really caught up to how we deal with that in a really way that's scalable. Like, how do we protect our journalists? And I don't know that we really have the answer to that yet.
That's such an important question, and the type of discourse that journalists are having with the public has changed so dramatically with the rise of digital media, and language is so important. Lissa, I want to ask about your book, Other People's Words. Speaking of language, it explores the connection between language and relationships. How does this understanding inform your approach to journalism, particularly in the digital age?
Well, thank you so much for mentioning the book. It's called Other People's Words, and the book is sort of a personal exploration of what it's like to lose people we love and then find them again and again through the language that they leave behind, and to recognize really the power of language, the power of words to hold us close to people who otherwise are gone from our lives, and to recognize the communities that exist within our language. And because our language is never our own, none of us speaks in a singular voice. And it is out of language that we form relationship. And so that is a bridge really to the work that I mentioned at the top on Language Please, which is an initiative funded by Google News. My colleague Chris Claremont has led the way with others in developing this dynamic free resource that is all about language, and across 7 different categories of what a journalist or storyteller might cover. So race and ethnicity, gender, sexuality, neurodiversity, class and social standing. Most recently, we added a section on religion and spirituality. And across each of these intersectional topics, what we offer is contextual guidance on how you might make decisions about what term to use, in a particular context, and almost more importantly, how you might think about framing of themes, topics, with a focus on service to the communities and engagement with the communities that you're reporting on, and authentic, genuine coverage. And one of the things that Language Please made a decision about early on was to be intersectional in the coverage, in the guidance, and not to be directive in the guidance. And that's been such an important principle. So when you talk about language and what role does language play, well, language is always changing, it's evolving. And so we decided not to be like an AP style guide or any one newsroom style guide. Those need to exist, and they exist for a reason, where they tell you, don't use this term, use this one instead. But what Language Please is aiming at is, how can we provide sufficient context that you, as a journalist, as a storyteller, as just a person in the world who's trying to decide what word to use or how to communicate, that you have sufficient context to be thoughtful and strategic in the words that you choose. And out of Language Please and related to Language Please, we've developed a course that's all about editing as relationship building. And so I guess that would be another thought just to add to the mix, is the ways in which, as journalists, we've thought about editing maybe in more narrow, not as humanized ways that an editor's job, and my day job is an editor, and I was trained to think about editing sometimes as like optimizing or improving the content, or making sure it's thoroughly fact checked. And of course those are absolutely vital to the work of an editor, but every edit is a moment in a relationship, and that's another dimension of this humanizing lens that I think you're bringing to the table, and that all of us work in that spirit. So really investing in frameworks that help us to understand and build self-awareness as editors, and then execute and implement that in relationship to writers or others that we're collaborating with. That's become another really important commitment of the work that we do at Language Please.
It seems like a lot of these conversations that are having positive outcomes are also conversations we wouldn't have been having 30 years ago. And they are in some ways a product of this digital moment that we're in. And so I want to talk a little bit more broadly about, and this is for anyone, maybe Lauren, you could start, but how has the rise of digital media impacted participation and representation of women, of young people, of people of color, of diverse voices in general in the public discourse?
Well, in many ways, look, it has profoundly democratized the ability of people to have a voice and weigh in on things that matter to them. I mean, that was ultimately always like sort of the intent of social media, and in its best form, like it definitely does that. And you think about the power and the influence that creators now have, right? Whether it's through YouTube, TikTok. I mean, YouTube is now the #1 podcast platform, right? So, all of these, the bar, and, you think about it, because YouTube, the bar to entry is so low. On TikTok as well. I mean, all of social media, what does it do? It has the potential to create millions and millions of citizen journalists, right? And that, I think, has power. And like, just the best examples of that are like what you're seeing and coming out of Syria, like the real time view that you can get, the cameras that people are carrying into prisons in Syria as they are trying to find their loved ones and release prisoners. I mean, it's absolutely riveting, and it's like you can't stop watching it. It is so extraordinary, those kinds of eyewitness. The flip side of that, obviously, though, is that, as we all understand, and I think we've come to understand in the last year or so, is that the potential for the proliferation of disinformation is vast. And as much as sort of the eyewitness, firsthand democratization of journalism has proliferated, right alongside of it, so has disinformation. And you saw that, again, just back to the Middle East. I mean, I think, the Israel-Gaza conflict is a great example of that. The reports about the numbers of deaths, which were getting reported by, eyewitnesses on the ground, went straight to the cover of the New York Times and turned out to be dead wrong, or the origins of the bomb. We saw that over and over again, in these very fast moving conflicts, where there are also actors who have who have self-interest in the way that the news gets reported are trying to shape it and influence it through a particular political lens. And then like that's not even to begin talking about the election, right? Which like, you know, we saw it really started in 2016 with sort of the social media interference of foreign actors. We had vast amounts of foreign actors infiltrating the social media landscape in the 2024 election, mainly the Iranians, not just the Russians. So like that is the flip side. It's like on the one hand, you do have this like incredible opportunity for anybody anywhere with a phone, you know, to be shaping the world that we see around us. And they are doing that in really extraordinary and often like magical and important ways. And the bar has lowered to enable, you know, young people, especially, you know, to have a voice in the way that we see the world. But, you know, when you talk about like Lissa talks about fact checking, I mean, there is no fact checking anymore. And it's not just that there's no fact checking, it's that the fact checking gets discredited. People make decisions about what they believe or they don't believe with there is no unifying feature in how that happens. It is just like, I think this is true or I don't think this is true. And that's incredibly dangerous, right? We saw a lot of that. You know, we see that in elections around the world, the amount of disinformation, you know, you combine that with AI, you know, and you have the potential for some really scary stuff. So like we're so weirdly like still so at the beginnings of this, right? It feels like we're just, especially when like we've barely scratched the surface on the impact that AI is going to have on all of this, right? So, you know, I mentioned deepfakes before. I'll just say like one more thing about it. You know, the voice deepfakes right now are already so convincing that like most people would not be able to tell the difference. The video deepfakes, a little bit more detectable, but that won't be true for long, you know? And so like this whole question about real and fake, you know, there are efforts to try to like create some regulations so that AI content has to be labeled as such. But right now it's completely the Wild West. So anything goes, anytime, any place, anywhere. And like we're seeing a lot of the consequences of that.
You've thrown so many important topics out there, Lauren, you know, talking about disinformation and fact checking and AI and first person narratives and how to navigate both these challenges and potential benefits of the state of media right now, which I think is kind of the perfect segue into talking about potential solutions, or at least, you know, how we might try and navigate this moment. And let's stick with this idea of, you know, first person narratives and the human beings behind the stories, because I think that empathy there is really, really important and might be part of, you know, leading us in the right direction. Gina had asked this question earlier about how do we take care of our journalists. And I think that's such a huge question. And also, I think there are roles for journalists to play in leading the way for civil and productive conversations. So let's go with that. You know, Gina, let's talk about strategies that journalists can use to foster more civil and productive conversations online, particularly around some sensitive and controversial topics.
Yeah, I mean, I think I put it less on the journalists themselves and I put it more on the news organizations, because I feel like it's almost not fair. I mean, we're expecting journalists to do everything now, right? Like report the story, find the story, also solve the incivility crisis. And in the meantime, can you do another story? You know, and I think what really has to happen is newsrooms have to start taking seriously the fact that their employees are in a situation where they're at risk and create guardrails for it. And what I mean by that is when I was a reporter way back in 1992, I covered prisons for a while, and I got a letter that appeared to be written in a red substance that may or may not have been blood. I didn't test it, I don't know, but it looked like blood. And this inmate wanted to kill me. Now, because it was 1992, I told a coworker, and I was like joking about it because I thought it was like, oh my God, this is so funny. This guy wants to kill me. Little old me, you know, like he's so much more powerful really than me. And my colleague was just like, we need to tell somebody about this. Could put you at risk. The way my newsroom treated that is the way we should treat online incivility. They called the sheriff's department. They brought somebody in. I was protected. Until news organizations are ready to do that, they're going to continue having people leaving because they're not protected.
Well, unfortunately, though, those don't work because I mean, I just can tell you, like I've done this. I've been through police departments. I mean, you're completely right. Like the news organizations do need to be accountable. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of resources even for them to protect people. Online threats are not viewed as they are not viewed as credible or actionable by most police departments. And they're certainly not being taken down by most of the social media platforms. So like that's one of the core problems is like, what can you actually do? Right. And I think, elected officials are dealing with the same thing. The bar to actually doing any kind of real intervention when threats like that happen is extremely high.
Yeah, and that's what I think has to change. I guess what I'm saying is
Yeah.
that we have to make news organizations and at the leadership, because I've talked to, people at the high levels of news organizations, and usually when I talk about this, what I get is, well, journalists have always been attacked and they just need to, get a thicker skin and get past this. And that's why we're in this problem, because I do think you're right, Lauren. I have no doubt. I mean, police blow off rape. So why would they not blow off online assaults? But until we start treating what happens online as serious as they treated this letter written to me by an inmate, we will not solve this problem. And it takes news organizations, it does take police, it also probably takes politicians to start holding platforms accountable for all this. They've done that in Europe, but in the United States, because of our First Amendment, there's this real reticence to do anything to manage social media platforms. So it's just going to get worse, to be honest. And the other thing I wanted to say about that is I also think that the democratizing role of, anybody can create a TikTok. Anybody can have a podcast. I mean, we're just replicating what happened in the 2000s with blogs, right? It was the same thing, right? We shifted from this authority model where people trusted experts to this model where let me just find someone online to agree with me, right? And then that's reinforcing you. But all of that's going on, what's important to know about it is it's still very hegemonic, meaning what is happening online, even though there's some democratizing of voices get out there who wouldn't normally, they are still disproportionately white voices and male voices. And that's another layer to this problem.
By the way, I've been having fun, and I say this tongue in cheek, getting really pissed off, speaking of the white male voices. If you're new to Blue Sky and you've been exploring Blue Sky, I encourage you to notice and pay attention to these starter packs that are floating around. Because what I have started to notice is like 90% of them are entirely male. And it's really starting to piss me off. And I have tagged, Blue Sky is like founded by women. So I've been tagging the leadership team, and like the monitors, but like over and over and over and over again, the starter packs of like authorities, when people are like putting a list of people that they think you should follow, I am telling you, not only is it like 90% men on almost all of them, even when there are women in the starter pack, the algorithm is pulling only the pictures of the dudes and putting it in the graphic. And like, if you're me and you like see sexism everywhere, because that's like my superpower, it really makes you want to throw something because it's supposed to be this more inclusive, like the whole premise of Blue Sky is like it's the anti-X, right? That it's supposed to be more liberal, more inclusive, etc. And guess what it's doing? It's repeating the same thing, Gina, that you just said, which is the authorities are still all the dudes.
Yeah. I want to stay on this topic of authority for a second because we've been talking about, AI has come up a few times in this conversation. We're talking about authority, versus democratizing the media, who gets heard. But there's a line of thought that AI could help return us to a model where expertise is valued because who puts out the information will feel more relevant again, rather than the information that is being put out. And I've seen that come up in a lot of places. I'm just curious what all of you think about that and whether you think that's a possibility or is it just more of a really nice thought?
I am definitely a believer that there are like two sides to AI, right? There's the bad actor side, and then there is the potential for doing, really good. And certainly on the sort of democracy front, certainly AI has the potential to help us parse, correct information and get to decent sources. One of the things that I am hopeful will, to Gina's point about legislation, there is a really simple and easy fix to some of the issues with AI online, which is actually advocated by Microsoft and a number of other big tech companies, which is essentially like AI labeling. And if you right now on your Instagram account go to post a picture, it actually gives you the option to tag it as AI content. What some of the tech firms want to do is actually to make that a requirement that any and all AI content has to have, basically in the same way like when you make a digital payment today and it has that little lock signal and it demonstrates to you that it is a secure digital payment. They want to do a similar thing with AI content online, which is that any AI generated content has basically a digital key to it that you can click on that actually tells you the origin of who generated it, when it was made, where it was made, and like whether or not it is, what's artificial about it. I think that is like one of the smartest, most interesting, and frankly, like low bars that we could possibly, move towards. And it's an easy one. And it's one that I think seems to have some reasonable bipartisan support. But like, that's the kind of thing, like my colleague's point about credibility, like those are the kinds of things we need, are those like instant checks that enable somebody who is not a especially sophisticated consumer to know instantly whether something is real or fake. I think the one thing that I think X has done really well in the era of Elon, and I mean it's one, but that is community notes. And actually, community notes has been really, really powerful because it is allowing fact check of content on Twitter real time, and it's pretty effective. And it's been pretty agnostic politically, which makes it super interesting. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, whether that innovation, which I really do think is probably one of the best innovations in social media today, is that community note fact checking. It's almost like a kind of Wikipedia that's attached to a post that anyone can do if they want to call out content as fake or as false. I'd like to see more of that, and like for us to figure out, I think to Gina's point, like, is there some way that then, for legitimate journalists, right now you've got like the verified check marks, which were kind of the primary way of doing this until Elon started selling them, right? So now you can like pay $8 and get verified. I think I'd love to see us swing back to the verification, because I think that was, that's one way, that we start to look at whether there's legitimate and illegitimate news sources, and they're very popular. Like people like this stuff. Consumers mostly want to know what they're consuming. So I think there's going to be some stuff like that we're going to start to see. Those are like a few things that I'm optimistic about.
That's really interesting. The AI generated tag that you mentioned, Lauren. I think it's part of this really important conversation that has been going on for a while of talking about where we're getting our information from, and also acknowledging that a lot of it comes from individual human beings. And I want to go back to talking about online harassment and continue with this idea of, tools and strategies for change. Lauren, you had mentioned that there's, an issue with resources. Gina, you were talking about a lot of this is just sort of a cultural framework around the importance and severity of these kinds of threats. What kind of strategies and tools can we use, not just to mitigate online harassment, but to acknowledge its severity and importance in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think I'm not super optimistic about that, because I think the reason we don't see online harassment as a big enough problem is because it disproportionately affects women. And so then it's immediately marginalized, that it's just women being hysterical. And, so it's not that different from, historically how women have been branded. And I think it's really interesting what Lauren said about Blue Sky perpetuating sexism in those lists. And in fact, I'm going to study that. Like
Oh, good. Can you let me know?
Because
Because right now it's like my very informal
yeah,
study
because
is like just
I
being
want,
pissed off every time I open it.
right. Well, it's such an important point because the problem is the sexism, racism, homophobia, and xenophobia is just baked into our whole media system, our whole life, our whole society. So the problem with it is it just being sexist, racist, and homophobic almost seems normal in America. I mean, that's the truth, right? Like that is the normal. And so we're really pushing up against that. So I don't know what the answer is because obviously people who have power want to continue to have power. And the best way to continue to have power is to continue squashing down the voices that say, wait a second, we have a right to. But I know for me, what I'm going to do is just keep yelling about this because I think it's important. And I think events like we're having today are important, right? Because how do we fix it? There's not one solution. I wish I could just say, do this and it will fix it. But I think it's all of this. It's like banding together, talking about this issue, and really talking about online as what happens online is just as serious as what happens offline. It's kind of the conundrum that happens with abuse, right? Emotional abuse is always seen as less serious than physical abuse, even though the psychological literature says emotional abuse might hurt you worse, right? Than physical abuse, right? I mean, or at least equally. And I think we have to see that what's happening online is it's not just emotional. Like there are real world ramifications of this. And I think we all get that, but that's a matter of convincing a lot of other people, I think.
Yeah, and I would just jump in to say, I mean, really informed and inspired by everything that's been said here. And it's having me reflect back on work that I was a part of for 3 years with youth journalists reporting on AI. The third year, the last month of when we had funding to be kind of running a desk with predominantly BIPOC reporters, journalists between the ages of 14, 24, reporting on these issues. The last month that we were funded to do that reporting was like the month before ChatGPT launched. So our timing was sort of exquisitely early in the sense that it's kind of amazing to be driving a conversation before it's become what everyone's talking about. And of course, I wish that it was happening in its fully robust form as everybody started paying attention. But I guess what I would say that is relevant to the conversation is, in addition to having to speak on these issues and have these conversations, listening to young people who are directly affected by these systems has been, to me, is another really important part of solutions. Because really, as emerging voices in journalism, there's they are on the front lines, almost first responders in a way to how these new features and functions come on board. And in some ways, the output of their reporting is about AI literacy. So it's, I think, reframing in some ways what a journalist's remit is, in addition to the additional supports and protections that they need, especially journalists of color, women, queer journalists, others who are in marginalized communities that have always been targeted. There's the additional kind of imperative around seeing ourselves as building literacy as these new affordances and risks come into our lives as a result of AI.
Staying on the path of talking about young journalists in particular, Gina, you're in the classroom training a new generation of young journalists. So how does that fit into this? What do you tell them about navigating this current moment?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I teach a class called social media journalism, and I also teach a class called online incivility. So clearly both of them deal with this issue. And what I teach them is, yes, here's what the literature says on engaging. We know engaging online, when journalists do it, the public likes it. The public wants them to engage. want, the public has an expectation that they'll engage. But we also teach them tools on how to engage and when to retreat, which to me is the biggest thing, is that you never have to put yourself at risk. You never have to put yourself in an emotionally risk situation. And I think that's what I teach my students. And that's certainly not something I was ever taught as a journalist. In fact, I was kind of taught the opposite, that being a good journalist meant doing anything to get the story. So I think it's revelatory to teach them, yes, you want to go do anything to get the story, but as a human being, you still have value and you do not have to put up with attacks, and you should report them. So I think that's part of it. I think that's slowly changing. I think the other thing in regard to AI that I will bring up is I think AI is scary, but also like has so many benefits. I wish we'd get ahead of AI in ways we didn't get ahead of social media. Social media just sort of happened and we were all like, oh, nothing, we don't have to do anything. And now, 20 years later, it's a complete cluster fire. And I worry that's going to happen with AI. But one thing we are doing is we've been testing out ways to use AI to sort of summarize comments that maybe it could be employed in like a content moderating system. We're testing to see whether that works. We're also doing some stuff where, AI is, we're using AI to write different versions of a news story. Not make it completely like a journalist is still doing it initially, but then different versions that might appeal to different groups of people. Like we have this idea of writing a news story in a way that really appeals to Gen Z. We haven't figured out exactly what that is yet, but that's one of the things we're doing with AI is saying, okay, we have this tool. It has so much benefits, but it also has all these scary things. But let's train our students on how to use it in a productive way.
I think that's such an important point with AI. You mentioned, we didn't get ahead of social media. In a lot of ways, we didn't really get ahead of the internet either when it started, and we ended up sort of being led down paths that maybe we could have avoided if we had gotten ahead of the technology. So I think that's a fantastic point about AI as well.
Yeah, and I'll add also that, I think a lot of people are very nervous about AI, and that might be coming from a place of having learned from not being nervous about certain types of technology that came out before. You mentioned social media, Gina, and that's a good point. And now I think a lot of people are used to questioning the impacts on mental health and democracy and all of these other impacts of media, and we are going into this moment of AI where hopefully we can be a little bit more thoughtful. I try and be hopeful about these things, and Savani in an earlier question framed it around, is it just a nice thought? But I do want to talk more about the potential benefits of AI and the potential benefits of this particular type of conversation around AI. Lauren, you had mentioned credibility and deep fakes and all of these issues. Do you think that, we're in a moment where the public has a bit more awareness about the potential downsides of that sort of thing and is open to talking about credibility and fact checking and accuracy?
I mean, probably not. But the people who, if I'm being honest, I think like, this election, we have very low media literacy in this country. It's a real problem. Other countries are doing more, like are, teaching kids, for instance, how to be effective news consumers and how to spot, how to really verify whether the news you're consuming is accurate or not. We're not even at the beginning of doing that. So I think we're a long way away. I would like to see a little, so I think there are a lot of potential benefits. And when Gina was talking about the sort of aggregating, certainly like in the democracy space, I think there's a lot of really positive potential for aggregating input through AI. Members of Congress, for instance, get huge numbers of letters and voicemails. Sorry, can you hear me? Sorry, I have an after-school kid invasion that I'm trying to block out. So there's, a lot of potential for like parsing large volumes of information. I mean, that's what AI does best, right? It's what it takes input and filters it. Like you can see it even now in the AI assisted in a Google search, right? Which is now coming up at the top of your feed. It's not always exactly accurate, but has this potential aggregator effect. I think there is a way in which I think we're going to start getting very comfortable with AI vetting information for us, and checking whether or not things are correct, or but in the same way that we've done with Google searches for the last like 15 years, right? Like that is ultimately sort of, I think, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but that's the stuff that I see as really promising. And I do think there is an access opportunity with AI that's very real, whether that's helping people access benefits better, understanding, how to vote, who is like what information is true or false. So all of that is potential. I think we just are a really, really long way, from that kind of literacy in the general public. But I also kind of wonder, just philosophically, if like at some point there is going to be a bit of a tipping point around this, that the need that people ultimately have for getting correct information or something that actually has truth, maybe will compel a bit of a shift back in the other direction, because it's just such a free for all at this point, right? Like there's just no guardrails at all. And what happens when you like need, like, I don't know, I keep thinking about like medical information. We went through this with like things like WebMD. Well, what happens when there's so many conspiracy theories floating around about any number of medical conditions? And like, you really just want to know, what is this? Is there science that says this is the thing that's going to keep me from dying? I don't know. So I think those are some of the ways in which, there is a potential for AI to help us kind of swing some of the information pendulum back the other way.
Yeah, and I think that connects to sort of the point I was asking about earlier, which is there going to come a point where, the answer to there's so much misinformation about medical conditions is that I need to talk to my doctor properly and to sort of center the value of that expertise again? And is that potentially
The
something
problem
we
is
might
people aren't believing their doctors. It's the other way around right now. It's like people are going to their doctors
right?
and saying, "I saw this thing online. I don't think you're right. I don't think it's true. I don't think what you're telling me is true." Right? That's happening in
Absolutely.
politics. That's happening in medicine. That's happening in all kinds of things, which is basically this confirmation bias, right? Which is like, I saw a
Yes.
thing, which is the thing that I wanted to believe, and that is, really powerful. And I'm gonna now like, I'm going to believe that now. I mean, the number of Trump voters, who, if you ask, some pretty basic questions about things that he's said or done, that don't believe those things are true, that impacted their vote is like very substantial. And by the way, the flip side is also true, right? Harris voters who don't believe that she ever called him a Nazi, as an example. So it's like, this is where, I don't know, this is why this conversation is not nearly long enough. We could be here for the next, like, we're going to be here for the next 40 years trying to figure this stuff out. So I don't think we solved it in the 51 minutes that we've been doing it. But they're really interesting and important questions. And like, I see a lot of positive use cases for AI. And I think just like with the emergence of social media and the internet, like we're barely scratching the surface now. And in another 5 years, we're going to see it completely differently than we see it now.
Yeah, if I
Yeah,
can jump in
let's.
here just to say
Yes,
one
please.
final thing about that. I think you're right. I think the problem is we have the technology to solve this problem, but we don't have the society or political will to do that, right? Like we have the technology to fact check, to have a media ecosystem that is accurate. But the problem is, and I think this is what Lauren brought up, is we have part of the country believing things that are just not true and not having and so it's not like it's a media literacy problem, but it's also sort of just like there half the country has just lost faith, I think, in all institutions, the media being one of those. And, to be honest, the media has made mistakes too. I would argue pretty bad mistakes during 2020 and 2024 in how they cover Trump and how they just cover this whole mess that has actually divided us more. So I'm actually less optimistic than I was even before, because I feel like this just keeps happening. And literacy can't fix all of it, because it's not that people don't know how to use the internet sometimes, it's that they choose not to believe the truthful things right in front of them.
Yeah, Gina, you bring up a really important point about trust in media and this connection between, journalists and media organizations and our audiences. I want to bring Lissa back into the conversation for a moment to talk about connections with audiences, and to ask, how can journalists or storytellers leverage digital platforms to build more authentic connections with audiences and perhaps foster a sense of belonging, particularly among marginalized communities.
Yeah, and a sense of belonging for people who are consuming content that they create, is that what you're pressing on?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think reflecting on just the full arc of, from sort of pitching ideas through sort of reporting out stories to finding strategies for distributing those, the content, to staying in a conversation in some form of engagement that happens in the afterlife of publication. I think there are three things that emerging voices in journalism are looking for, in order to build that sense of belonging for themselves and with audiences, and that's mentorship, collaboration, and reciprocity. And mentorship can take a lot of forms. I mean, in the youth-driven newsrooms that I've been a part of, mentorship is equally likely to happen among peers as it is with sort of veteran journalists or editors. Those collegial relationships with people who've been around for a while and can bring that expertise, speaking of expertise and authority, are crucial to have access to folks who've been doing this for a while. And I would say likewise, mentorship with near peers, with people who are coming up in the same climate, who have been raised with the same social media, tools and platforms, can provide crucial support, skill sharing. So, that's the mentorship piece. On the collaboration side, I think, we talked about it in earlier days of journalism, where you did anything required to get the story, and you also tended to work in a very siloed way. It was you and your piece. And I'm seeing more and more opening up of what that collaboration looks like, in a very intentional way as stories are being developed. And likewise, content being rolled out in a more iterative way. So audiences or communities are participating in the shape of, a coverage area or series. And then that reciprocity is really recognizing that, journalists are not only holders of knowledge that is then released and revealed to audiences who consume it, but it's a much more reciprocal relationship. And so, the challenge, of course, is how do we create conditions where that reciprocity, that conversation, that engagement that happens around content is positive and supportive and doesn't, digress and derail into harassment and other harmful dynamics for both audiences and the creators.
I want to stick with you, Lissa, for a second, because we've talked about challenges, we've talked about fears, we've talked about theoretical positives, but your work has been to help empower journalists to use technology for social good, and I think we would all appreciate, hearing specific examples of what that looks like. So can you share some examples of projects that demonstrate that human-centered approach that allows journalists to use technology for social good?
Yeah, I mean, I would talk about our AI coverage over a 3-year period, when some really important tools were coming on board in a consumer market, and including tools that involved use of facial recognition software and what during the pandemic was called virtual proctoring. So on the facial recognition side, we did a project, and by we I mean Youth Radio, YR Media, partnering for this project with Stanford Design School, called Erase Your Face. And it was an interactive project that combined journalism, design, data, and coding, where we designed a tool that allowed users to upload AI-generated portraits, images of people's faces, and experiment using a drawing feature with how much one had to disguise that image in order for it not to be detectable by facial recognition software. So it was this playful way to play with a very serious set of issues around surveillance society, around bias, racial bias, and other kinds of bias that were baked into those tools and continue to be this many years later. So that project was an opportunity to take, for young people, as you say, to be an empowered position to develop an experience for other users. That wasn't full of dread, that wasn't a miserable experience, that in fact was quite playful, and sort of there was a moment of delight when you finally beat you kind of slid past detection with the right kind of marking up of this image. So that's number one. And then the other one, I mentioned virtual proctoring tools. During the pandemic, many of the young journalists that we were working with were also in various classrooms, high school, college level classrooms. And more of their instructors were turning to virtual proctoring tools to prevent cheating because the students were having to take tests in their homes and no longer, in a controlled environment. And as you can imagine, and these virtual proctoring tools were powered by AI and introduced massive problems. They had racial bias in how they were designed. They totally interfered with the relationship between students and teachers because there was a presumption of cheating, right? And then the level of surveillance that was happening inside personal spaces when you had to basically authorize your computer to track micro moves that you were making as you were taking a test. Huge problems, and students around the country created petitions and mobilized against use of these tools in their universities and in other learning environments. And we released that as a series called Surveillance U, and it was a way to amplify youth, organizing around their own well-being and equity in their classrooms. And there was also a playful element to that too, because we created a sort of simulator that heightened the experience of being surveilled as you were taking a test. So, there were stories where if you had a cat that marched across, your laptop, you would be flagged as having cheated. So we played up these different moments and created videos that sort of brought those out. So I think that combination of a sort of serious, hard-nosed investigative reporting that we know is needed to hold power accountable with a sort of playful, interactive experience that ironically can also sometimes use AI technology to produce those experiences and unlock moments of delight, of deep creativity on the part of young people. That's where I've seen impact on the part of the creators of those tools in terms of the skills that they acquire and the sense of agency that they achieve through the making of those tools. And then by distributing them to real audiences, we're able to shift understanding and perceptions of how this technology operates in our lives.
These are some fascinating projects you're talking about, Lissa, so thank you for sharing that with us. I want to wrap up with a question that might be perhaps the most difficult question for all of our esteemed panelists with all of their knowledge of the challenges we face right now. And that is, in this wild moment in media, what gives you hope? And I'd like to start with Lauren.
No, why do you have to start with me? That's so not fair.
You did say you have to leave soon.
I took
so
all the hard
forget.
ones. All right, fine. What gives me hope? Yeah, I mean, listen, I do think I sort of said it before, like, I just can't stop thinking about these videos coming out of Syria, and I just think the way in which local people around the world now have the tools to communicate, is pretty extraordinary. And I do think that changes the way that we think about the world in some really positive ways. And, I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful that I can get access without always having the filter of somebody else deciding, what I want to see. There's downsides to that, as we've discussed, but I am optimistic about that because I do think there is a sort of global movement of citizen journalism that, that's powerful.
How about you, Gina?
Oh yeah. this is an easy one for me. What gives me hope is my students. I mean, the fact that there are students who are still so engaged about journalism and so excited about it, and also understand the nuances of how journalism is different, even though they didn't live through the old days, but they know it's like evolving. So I think that gives me hope. And it also gives me hope because I see the coverage that young people are doing. You know, we saw this with the Gaza protests across university campuses, right? I mean, student journalists were doing that coverage and doing an amazing job. Like I know at UT, the student journalists were bucking the administration to tell the story they needed to tell. And they stood up to the administration in a way that is so admirable for them at this stage. And that gives me hope. That gives that, you know, that they still have that drive that I remember having and that you need as a journalist. So I'm hopeful that we'll get out of this mess eventually.
Yeah, eventually being a key word, but I also share that hope. Lissa, would you like to share?
Well, I would just plus one at everything that Gina just said. I have the very lucky experience of having built my whole career around partnering with young content creators, young creators of some kind or another, and a big chunk of that young journalists, emerging journalists. And so I just really share what Gina so eloquently described, where it's not hard for me to access that sense of hope and just how much we have to learn and what it feels like to just enter a creative space with you know people who are telling stories in ways that are so vital and so true. And and I will say, you know, being attached to various newsrooms in these last couple of months, journalists just keep showing up. I mean, just being able to sit in an editorial meeting, like as the most extreme things happen locally, nationally, globally, and just keep showing up and pitching stories and getting into it and giving feedback and putting out on deadline. There is just a hopefulness, at least for me, and maybe it's I'm blessed by the kinds of newsrooms that I get to be close to, where I believe in that content, I depend on it. I don't, there's thing, I look at people who are just doing daily breaking news type stuff, and I've never known how to do that in that way that real, true breaking news reporters do, and getting to just be up next to them as they're doing that and chasing truth and impact. You know, I keep believing in it as the fourth estate, as you know, just absolutely crucial to our democracy.
I'll also share that the thing that gives me hope is speaking to people like you who are not afraid to face these incredibly complex and important and difficult issues head on, to speak about it and to have that realistic outlook, but then also to keep that kernel of hope alive. So thank you all.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, you know, change is rooted in those seeds of hope. So thank you for sharing yours, all of you, with us. And thank you for this important and fascinating conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.